Well, the day has finally come after much waiting. I'm gonna start putting this motor back together. Hopefully we don't run into any problems. I had a different crank and thought I could use it. It was standard, and this turned out to be a 24X crank instead of a 58X. I may have already told you that. So this is the crank that came out of the GTO. So I sent it off and had it turned, and that took 3 weeks. So I've been waiting on that, which means the standard bearings I bought are now useless to me. So I ordered some 20 under bearings because it turns out that the crank was already 10 under. Well, the odd thing about that is this thing has standard bearings in it. So probably that's why this thing let loose in the first place. It was rebuilt like 6 months ago. So, I guess they put standard bearings in a 10 under motor. Maybe nobody checked the clearances. So we're gonna put all this stuff back in that motor, starting with the cam and crank. So we're gonna start doing that right now and hopefully get this thing back together. And the only thing I'm really kind of a little bit worried about is we're switching to Ls3 heads, and these are flat top pistons with no valve release, and it's a pretty big camshaft. So I'm wondering if we're going to run into piston to valve clearance issues. So we're going to have to check that and see. I may have to fly cut the pistons to make this thing fit, but that'll take some time to get the tool and everything. So we may be delayed. We'll see. Let's get it together and see if it'll fit or not. I'll let y'all know. First thing I'm going to put in is the camshaft. I like to put them in before the crank so I can get my hands in there and help the cam in. This time I'm using this Lucas assembly lube. I've used different types of grease and stuff, but I'm going to try this stuff this time. It's a roller cam, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to put some of this on all the bearings and on the camshaft and stuff. I'll wipe all this on there really good with some gloves and before I stick the cam in there. So that's what I'm going to use on this engine. We'll see how it goes. Trying to do all this with one hand. I just left the cam gear on the front to give me something to hold on to here at the end. Push the main bearings down in there. One mistake you could make is the bearing half that has the holes in it goes on the block side. The side that has no holes goes on the main cap side. The center one is called your thrust main. That's what sets how much in play the crank has. So I'm going to put these in dry. I'm going to set the crank in it dry and check my clearances. If the clearances are good, then I'm going to put oil down in these holes, put oil in the bearings, set the crank in it. So I got my plastic gauge here. You can buy that at a parts store if you've never used it. It comes in a wrapper like this. It's a little stick of like kind of wax material. So you want to set everything in here dry. I'm going to lay the main cap over this and tighten it down to spec. Take it back off without rocking it or doing anything to squeeze it out farther. Then depending on how much it squishes this, you line it up with this chart, and it'll tell you if you're 2,000, 3,000, 4, 5, 6. And usually you want 1,000th for every inch of journal size. So a lot of times on the rods it'll be 2 to 3 thousandths. On the mains it'll be more like 3. So somewhere in that area usually, depending on what you're doing with the motor. So let's see how this works. This is what it looks like after you torque it down. You put your little chart up there. Looks like we got 3 thousandths. This is about, I don't even know what the mains are, but I know it's around 3 inches. So 3 thousandths is good for me. So we're gonna put all the oil on it. Take the crank back out, oil everything, put it back in, and tighten all the main caps down. And check the end play. Now I'm checking crankshaft end play. So I put the dial gauge on the end of it, and I take this is with the mains tightened down. I take a big, huge screwdriver, push the mains, push the crank back and forth. I have 2 thousandths, which I assumed was way too little, but when I looked it up online, it says between 1.5 thousandth and 7. So I guess I'm gonna leave it alone then. It's got 2, so that's within spec. So on to the next thing. One thing I forgot to say was the mains. I looked up the torque specs. You're supposed to torque them to 15 foot-pounds, and then these inners, you go 80 degrees farther, and the outers you go 51 degrees farther. So I torqued them to 15 foot-pounds on my cheap torque wrench. I just used a normal ratchet after that and guessed at the 80 and the 51 degrees, so I'm not too worried about it. And these side bolts torque to 18 foot-pounds on them. So then the connecting rods, it says 15 foot-pounds and then another 85 degrees. So that's your torque specs on your mains and your rods. After you get it all torqued down and check your clearance and end plate and stuff, you always want to make sure the crank spins freely in there. Because if it don't spin freely, something's wrong. You need to stop, take it apart, and figure out what it is. But this one seems to spin freely. I mean, there's a little resistance because it has that really thick Lucas oil on the bearings, but aside from that, it spins real freely. So now we're on to the rod bearings. I use this type of plastic gauge because it's for 1 to 3 thousandths, and this should be around 2.5 thousandths, something like that. So we put the plastic gauge on there, tighten the cap down, and as you can see, I'm at 2 thousandths, so that's good with me. I usually try for 2 on the rods, 3 on the mains. I'm not ultra picky with this stuff, but so now I'm going to clean that off and oil the bearings up and go ahead and put all the pistons and rods in. I already checked the gap on the rings and it's got like 25 thousandths, so I'm not going to touch the rings. We're just going to throw this thing together. You always need to, after you put a rod and piston, turn the motor over and make sure there's nothing, no resistance. It spins freely still. That way, if you get to one of them and it's all of a sudden tight, something's up. You don't want to put all 8 of them in and then something be wrong. So, in the past, I've used one of those spring, or not spring, but ring compressors that is like it's a band that goes around it and you lock it down and it works on all different bore sizes. But this right here is way easier. I bought this when I built the Starlet. I would recommend buying one of these. It makes your life way easier. They're not that expensive. And the piston just slides right down the hole. You don't have to deal with that ratchet deal. It doesn't usually work good. These things work perfect, work every time. Piston just falls right in there. You want to have the crank rotated down to the bottom of the journal. Kind of get your hand under here and hold the rod so it doesn't hit your crank journal. One thing I think I forgot to mention is the oil passages in the crank. You want to blow those out. It'd be good to run through them with brushes, blow them out, because sometimes if you have your crank turned, the machinist may have not cleaned the metal out of those holes. So the oil passages that go up and down through your crank, you want to clean those out before you put the crank in too. I got all 8 pistons in, motor turns over free, put number 1 on top dead center. So looks like everything's gonna be good. All our clearances look good. So now I'm gonna put probably the oil pump on, timing chain, and then we can check about our piston to valve clearance questions. So I got this tensioner bolted on. That was the mystery piece. I couldn't figure out what was missing when I took it apart. So I bought a new one, Chinese one, with Chinese bolts, and put that on. Line the dots up here, top dead center number 1, and bolted all this down. Now we're going to go on to the oil pump. Got the oil pump on there. I put a bunch of that Lucas assembly lube down in the oil pump. Timing chain's on there, windage tray's on there. I don't do anything special when I install the oil pump. I just kind of try to center it up and bolt it down. I know you can put like feeler gauges in there. I don't do any of that. This is very important on an LS motor. The oil pump O-ring. It comes with two. Depends on if you have a straight or a tapered pickup tube. Mine's straight, so I use the black O-ring. You want to oil it up really good. You do not want to pinch this O-ring or you will not have oil pressure. When I first built the wagon, I had that issue. I had low oil pressure. My truck I drive all the time right now is having oil pressure issues because of a wore out O-ring. So this is very important. Make sure you replace the O-ring and do it correctly. Oil it up, don't pinch it. I'm about to check piston to valve clearance. So my daughter had some sparkly Play-Doh, so we're gonna put it on this piston top. I've already sat the cylinder head on here. Ooh, there it is, and bolted it down, the 4 bolts around the cylinder. This is the old gasket. I'm just throwing it on there because I don't want to mess up the new one. And I've got my lifters in there, which I've had my lifters sitting in oil for weeks. And put my lifters in there, push rods, rocker arms, all that, my little pedal stools. And I'm going to turn this motor over. I know it doesn't hit, but that doesn't mean it may have 1,000th clearance, which is not enough. So we're about to put it together, turn it over, and see how much clearance it has by this Play-Doh. Now I've got it back together, got the push rods in there. Thought I'd mention, if you put Ls3 heads on a motor like I am, you have to have offset rocker arms on the intake side. So you can see those are offset. So every other rocker has to be replaced with an offset rocker. So we're going to turn this thing over now and see how our piston to valve clearance is. See the exhaust valve's going down. Now the intake's going down. And then we'll take this head back off and measure it and see how much space we have. I'm going to do it twice, just to make sure. Okay, we'll take it apart. Here's what it looks like. Now what I'm going to do is find the point where it's the closest to the piston, take a razor blade and cut through it, and we'll measure that with the caliper and see how many thousandths clearance we have. Looks like I put a little much in there. I really didn't know how much to use. It's been a long time since I've done this, so we're going to measure it now. So we cut a cross section on it and found the closest spot right here and measured it, and we're really good, 120 thousandths. So hopefully we'll be fine with piston and valve clearance. I think we're good with that. I really haven't looked up the specs, but I'm going to look it up. But 120 thousandths seems like a lot to me. Now that we got good piston to valve clearance, I'm going to put the cylinder heads on the motor. The cylinder head gaskets, I'm using our Ls9 head gaskets. They're, I believe, 7-layer. I'm using them because I just wanted the best head gasket I could get. I feel like it's a little better gasket than the stock one. Got to put the cylinder head dowels back in. I have put motors together without these, but I want to put it in this one. So I'm going to put the dowels in, make sure the head and block's really clean and everything, and bolt the cylinder heads down with the ARP head bolt. So the ARP head bolts, it says to clean the washers with brake cleaner, so I did, got them dry, and I put the moly lube on the threads of the bolts just a little bit, thread them all down there. Now I'm going to torque them to spec. Here is what it says on the specs, so we're going to do that now. I got all the rocker arms on. Once again, you can see the offset on the intake ones, and got all the head bolts tightened down. The final torque spec is 80 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to put the ugly silver valve covers that used to be red on here, and get all the valve train covered up, and we'll go to the other cylinder. Before I put this other cylinder head on, I noticed there's a mark right here where the, looks like maybe the piston and valve touch or something got in the combustion chamber, and it had a really sharp edge sticking up. You never want any sharp edges in your combustion chamber or your cylinder head. Sometimes a piston will have it right in the center where it was machined. So I took a file and filed that down smooth, so to keep from having any, that'll give you a hot spot and cause detonation. So gotta watch out for stuff like that right there. Now we got the other cylinder head, the rocker arms on it, push rods. Everything bolted down, got the ugly valve cover on it. I went ahead and bolted down the lifter valley cover. Now I'm going to put the timing cover on it. I'm going to leave all the bolts loose. I always leave them loose until I get the oil pan on, because the oil pan bolts from the bottom. That seems to square everything up. So I want to loosely put these bolts on and then put the oil pan on, and we'll tighten everything down after that. Now we're assembling the oil pan. It has this fancy tray in it. You guys saw in the older video how much metal was in this pan, so I really cleaned it good. So it has this crazy deal that sends oil from the pump back to the filter. I don't really like how many seals it has, but so we got that guy in there. We're going to put this plate on the end. You can drill a hole in this and feed your turbos. You can drill a hole in, or not drill a hole, but put a fitting in either one of these to feed a turbo or an oil pressure gauge. So you got those two options, and then there's also the one at the back of the block on the top behind the intake. So there's your options on the oil. We bolted the oil pan down. The way I like to do it, I don't know what's the right way. This makes the most sense to me. I bolt the oil pan bolts that are on the block all down tight. Then I bolt the end bolts down tight to square up the timing cover and the rear main seal. Then once I get all the oil pan bolts tight, then I finish tightening the timing cover and rear main seal bolts. This I figured out 2 seconds ago. Somebody has tightened this one down incorrectly and cracked this oil pan right around through here. So they had already put a layer of former gasket on it. Well, we put a second coat on there. So that thing's guaranteed not to leak now. So we're gonna go ahead now and put the water pump harmonic balancer on it, and then it's time to mate it to the transmission. When we got the harmonic balancer on there, I used my install tool again from Summit, because the crank bolt is not long enough to pull it up there. So use that, got it on there. It's got a big hump knocked out of it, so that should keep it in balance. We got the water pump on there. The intake's just sitting on there because it's going to be in the way of our chain for the putting the motor back in. I bolted the knock sensors back on. They had them on here. Maybe you LS people know why, but this is the factory location. Only thing I could guess is if that's in the way of the headers, but I put them back in the stock location. So we got those on there, and I'm going to take this off because I fixed the heater hose leak issue. And we got the oil galley plugs put back in on the motor that I had taken out to clean everything. These plugs, I got those put back in there. So now I think that's pretty much it for what I'm going to do as far as on the stand. I'm not going to put the starter and accessories on it sitting here. So I'm going to pull it off the stand and put the flywheel and clutch on it and bolt the transmission back up, and then throw it back in this turd and hopefully get it driving before too long, because this is supposed to be my daily driver now that I've sold the station wagon. Motor off the stand, the goat's clawing its way in the building. And I'm putting some red Loctite on these flywheel bolts. And we're gonna get the flywheel and clutch on here, get the transmission bolted to it, and put the accessories on the front of the motor and get this thing in the car. You got to clean all the oil off your flywheel. They're shipped with oil on them, just like brake rotors are. And you don't want any of that oil on there. You want it bare metal with no oil, so you don't get oil on your clutch surface. So I got my clutch alignment tool in there. Got Loctite on all my bolts. I'm gonna try to get even pressure on this. Tighten it up kind of evenly. We had to make a trip to the store because I didn't have oil in the filter, and I didn't have an AC belt, I thought. And then when I got back, I found the darn thing underneath the tote. So, but we got all the accessories on there now. We got the motor mounts and stuff on, transmission on it. So I replaced this motor mount here because this one was totally shot. This thing is a spinner, and you can see all the stuff that's come out of it. So got the motor mount changed out. I'm about to take the steering shaft loose because you have to take it loose to get the header on. So I'm going to take the steering shaft loose, put the header in there. Probably going to set both headers down in it and set the motor around on top of them if I can. I think that'll be the easiest way. But yeah, so we're going to set this thing down in here next. I think we're ready to. We'll see. All right, so that header goes around the steering shaft, which I hate, but I guess that's what you deal with when you have long tube headers. I don't know, everything I've ever had a turbo on it. So we're about going to set the motor down in there if it'll fit. That's the next step. We'll see. So a lot's went on since the last video clip. Got a lot of the little detail stuff done. Me and Honey Bunny bled the clutch. Got the drive shafts hooked back up. Got the plug-ins for the transmission done. I still need to put this pipe on there, but I couldn't find the nuts and bolts for it. I can't find other ones that fit it, so we may restart this thing open headers. But I'm about to put the intake on. I did the same thing I did with the little car. I had some of this, it's like exhaust heat shield off of like Volkswagen, and I cut it to the size under the intake to just keep some heat off the intake. I'm sure it doesn't do much, but it makes me sleep better at night. I think I saw that originally on the Faster Proms YouTube channel. So I'm using that idea he had. So I'm going to put this thing on, and then we're probably going to have to make some spacers here for the fuel rails. And then I might just start this thing with no water in it and open headers just to see, make sure it has oil pressure and stuff. So there you go. That's where we're at. More stuff on there. Got the radiator, condenser, fans, the air box. I don't like this being here. I realize it's getting hot air. I'm going to do something with that later. But I had to space up the fuel rails, so I used a 5/16 nut under there to space the rails up. So now I'm going to turn the motor over with the plugs out, no coils, no injectors, until I get some oil pressure. I don't want to start it dry. We're going to go ahead and make this pipe. This is a 3-inch pipe. It's actually a truck step bar. It's 13.5 inches long. We cut it down to. This is a factory nut start that we ground out of it and knocked out. And if you don't have an oxygen sensor bung, you can get an 18mm spark plug non-fouler and cut from here off of there and use from here down as an oxygen sensor bung. So we're going to cut these in half, weld them in here for our second oxygen sensor on each bank, and get the exhaust welded up and start this thing. That's what it looks like after you cut it in half and weld it on there. Cut everything from here up off, and you get an oxygen sensor bung without having to search all over town for one. We're ready to start this thing, and I was going to show you guys. I bought this stuff for engine break-in from Lucas. It's got a bunch of zinc in it. I probably don't need it with a roller cam, but I figured I might as well go overboard with it. So we're going to start it, try to bleed the air out of the cooling system with this thing, and get the motor up to temperature for the first time. See how this goes. as you heard, it runs good. Motor seems to be fine. It's got good oil pressure. I love how the camshaft sounds. I'm not really used to driving a car with that big of a cam and a manual transmission, so had to get used to revving it up quite a bit more than normal. But transmission is acting a little funny. I'm hoping it's just a shifter. It doesn't want to go in reverse hardly at all unless you're rolling backwards already. It's a little clunky going in some of the other gears, so I'm going to take the shifter out on another video and see what's up with it. But I'm happy with how the motor turned out. I haven't really beat on it yet, but we drove it around here a couple miles and it seems to be doing okay. We changed the break-in oil out for some Mobil 1 0W40, filled it up with that. So we're going to put some miles on this thing and try to figure out why the shifter's acting up. And I don't know if it's a starter or battery, but we drove it to the gas station and it wouldn't start back. It was like the battery was dead. So the alternator's charging, so we got to figure out what's up with that. So just your normal kinks you got to iron out. But you'll see some more about this car on future videos.